Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar from Infrastructure Victoria on the gas advice. My name is Michel Masson, and I'm the CEO of Infrastructure Victoria. We're delighted that you could join us today to hear and discuss about the early findings on our interim report towards 2050 gas infrastructure in a net zero emissions economy. To start with, let me introduce you with the cracking team from Infrastructure Victoria that I got with me today, starting with Elisa McNamara, who is the project director on this very important research. Jonathan Spear, who is the deputy CEO, who's been leading that with Elisa. And then in the background, no less important, we've got Madeleine Brennan, who's been instrumental in communications to help us on this presentation and will facilitate the questions. And of course, we've got Neris Webster, who is a special matter expert and who's been also very key in helping Elisa putting together this presentation and, more importantly, this report. Before we begin the official proceedings, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we are virtually meeting today and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. Without their wisdom and care of the land for thousands of years, we wouldn't be living in one of the most livable parts of the world. So today we'll go through the webinar. First and foremost, I will do a couple of introductory comments just to put the context, and then we'll hear from Elisa, who will present the early findings reflected in the interim report, which I hope you had an opportunity to read before this webinar. And then, of course, we'll open the webinar for questions. You can enter any questions you have into the discussion panel on the right-hand side of the screen. And please make sure you include your name and your organization so that Maddie and Neris can filter and pass those questions to us with all the information they need. I'm sure that you're all very familiar with that drill, but if you could make sure that you please mute your microphones, and then we'll be very happy to engage with you when we open up to the conversation. And please note that we are recording this webinar for the benefit of those who haven't been able to join us in the future. Okay, so let's move on to just a couple of contextual comments. Most of you would be very familiar with who Infrastructure Victoria is, but in the context of this discussion, there's just a couple of points that I'd like to reinforce before we go to the interim report. First and foremost, we are an independent statutory authority. And I stress on that word because it makes us absolutely unique within the Victorian public sector. The legislation which created Infrastructure Victoria has got a sentence that says the minister cannot direct nor control the activities of Infrastructure Victoria, making us truly independent in the way we look at controversial issues, difficult policy reforms, but also enabling us to go towards you and engage in very good conversations, making sure that for you, we're not having any hidden agenda, we're not dependent upon some interest, we're genuinely willing to hear from you and have demonstrated in the past and will continue in the future that when we hear something of value that we haven't considered, we will take that into consideration. Infrastructure Victoria was created to fulfill three main functions. First and foremost, to undertake on a regular basis the 30-year infrastructure strategy being tabled in Parliament. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to announce to you that we will be in a position to table on the 18th of August of this year the refreshed 30-year infrastructure strategy, which will crown years of work and conversation with all of you, but most importantly will be the beginning of a big discussion around those recommendations, which the Victorian government will have to officially respond to within 12 months. And of course, another important function which leads us to having the conversation we're having today is to provide advice independently on any matters on infrastructure that the Victorian government wants us to work on. And finally, of course, we undertake independent research on any infrastructure matters that we see fit. Most of you would know that we've certainly been very, very active in the past over the years to promote strong pricing reforms in the transport sector. We're very clear on our role. We recommend, government decides, and we're very clear that our purpose is to make sure that through strong influence, building the consensus, the understanding and acceptance to really support the implementation, we really enable the decisions that should be made by the Victorian government of any political persuasions to be favorable to the outcomes that we've identified are necessary for the Victorians. We're certainly not here to revisit decisions that have been made in the past. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Elisa. So just entering concretely into the purpose of our discussion today. We received back in December a request for advice from the Treasurer on behalf of the Victorian government. Most of you would have had an opportunity to read the full terms of the reference on our website, but briefly we were asked to provide an advice relating to Victoria's gas transmission and distribution networks under a range of different scenarios, all aiming at contributing to hit the legislative target of net zero emissions by 2050. And of course, looking at scenarios is the best way to look at an uncertain future. And we were asked to assess the relative economic, social, and environmental impacts of each scenario and identify infrastructure decisions that need to be made and when to ensure opportunities for the existing gas infrastructure can be optimized and emissions reduction targets are met. This, of course, includes exploring the extent to which gas infrastructure can be used for emerging technologies, including hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and biomethane. And to note that, of course, this request for advice complements and inform the work being undertaken in parallel by DELP on the gas substitution roadmap. The purpose for us is to be able to deliver the final advice to the Victorian government at the end of 2021. And this launch of the interim report, which Elisa will present to us very shortly, is really the beginning of a consultation and engagement with you all in order to make sure that all of the expertise, all of the different views, counter evidence to what we have already produced will be taken into consideration. So I stress on the fact that this interim report doesn't have any recommendations, doesn't have any specific advice to the government. This is our way at Infrastructure Victoria to share transparently with all of you the status of our thinking, the results of all of our studies and analysis already undertaken, which please make sure that you go on our website and look at all of the reports that we have from consultants or that we produce ourselves, and really coming to you and say, okay, this is where we're at the moment. What do you think? Are we on the right track? Have we forgotten something? Is there anything else that we should consider to make sure that we tap into the profound, valuable body of knowledge that you all have within your respective expertise, and to take that into consideration in our final advice. So this is really the context for this interim report. And I would like now to hand over to Elisa to go into the details of what those early findings are. Thank you very much, Elisa.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to run through, give you an overview of what's in the interim report and what we have done so far, give you a very quick snapshot of our early findings. We will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. So just a reminder that you can type those into the box on the right-hand side. And we're looking forward to answering those questions a bit further into the webinar. So so far, we've been working on this project for 6 months. We've completed a literature review, an interjurisdictional analysis, and some initial scenario analysis. All of those technical reports are available at our website, and we very much value your, as Michelle said, any insights and indeed any counter evidence to those. So the literature review was focused on the key issues and opportunities for gas infrastructure in Victoria as we transition to net zero emissions by 2050. Information was sourced from academia, industry, think tanks, and other government sources. And the review was to really help us understand where the gaps are in the current evidence that are most relevant to our terms of reference and what further research we might need to do to help address government's questions of us. It was not intended to be any kind of comprehensive review of all of the peer-reviewed literature on the technologies, but was really focused on understanding the current knowledge base on risks and opportunities for the existing natural gas infrastructure, what pathways are proposed for gas sector decarbonisation around the world, what the technical and commercial maturity of those pathways is, and what modelling has been done to understand the relative environmental, social and economic costs and benefits of those pathways and the transition. We were also looking to understand the role for government in this transition and what thinking has been done within Australia and around the world on that so far. So the literature review found, as many of you will know, that Victoria's gas consumption is very high compared to other jurisdictions, that the majority of use is by households and the commercial sector, particularly for heating, but that industrial use also comprises around 30%. Emissions from natural gas at the moment account for almost 1/5 of Victoria's total. We did look at and find a lot of information around the predicted gas shortfall, although obviously the timing of this is uncertain, depends on many factors, including the weather. And we did find that there is significant potential, but really that everyone is talking about the same possible decarbonisation pathways, really. And they are carbon capture and storage, hydrogen of many colours, and also biomethane, biogas and electrification. But many of those technologies are not there yet. So we're still very much in a phase of R&D and trying to figure out what works. Not just Victoria's in this boat, but the entire global economy. We did an interjurisdictional analysis. Now, this analysis considered places in Australia and around the world which had a similarly high reliance currently on natural gas and similar commitment to net zero emissions. And we were trying to understand who's well progressed down this path and how did they get to the point that they're at? What are they considering? And the UK and the Netherlands are furthest advanced. Canada is doing a lot that is focused on emissions reductions from their very significant fossil fuel industry. Japan, we did a little bit of shall we call it a shallow dive instead of a deep dive, given the very prodigious efforts that they are putting into developing their hydrogen economy. As requested in the terms of reference, we have also been looking at a number of possible scenarios for net zero emissions in Victoria by 2050. So these scenarios are designed to be plausible, but some more or less likely than others. The idea was really to test some of the extremes and the bounds of what may be possible, look at the relative costs and benefits of those, and we are then using those results to narrow those scenarios down into something that is more plausible, more cost effective, more environmentally beneficial. We're going to be doing some more scenario analysis in phase 2, just kicking off now, and that will inform our final recommendations to government. So the 4 scenarios that we looked at, again, no real surprises there given the pathways that we've all discussed. Some more extensive electrification in scenario A. Scenario B is around more extensive electrification but supported by gas-fired electricity generation. Scenario C is essentially a zero emissions as opposed to net zero emissions scenario by 2050, and is really based on the assumption that hydrogen costs come down very significantly and the technology becomes very broadly available, supported by renewable energy generation. Scenario D is really about testing the limits of what might be possible through the use of brown coal in Victoria to supply large-scale hydrogen production supported by very similarly large-scale carbon capture and storage. So our scenarios looked at the entire energy demand for Victoria. That's why you'll notice this pretty high number on the left-hand side here. And this enables us to look at things like the impacts and the crossover with the transport sector, look at trucking, look at the private vehicle mix, and what that does to the electrification scenario and the hydrogen scenarios in particular, because that obviously does impact on economies of scale for those technologies, which in turn will impact on an optimal transition scenario for natural gas as we move forward towards 2050. So this graph is just showing us how that energy mix has moved through those different scenarios over time. The darkest color is fossil fuels, and obviously you can see that reducing to pretty much near zero. Renewables includes renewable electricity generation through solar, wind, and hydrogen and hydroelectricity. Obviously, that's significantly increasing over time. And the hydrogen production shown in light blue. We also looked at biogas, which is shown in this second lightest blue colour. There is some use of biogas in the Victorian economy at the moment, so we are interested in what the potential might be for Victoria to ramp that up, as has happened in Europe, for example. So this summary of results shows us that we have some pretty reasonable job creation possibilities over all of these scenarios. I know there's a lot of talk about the impacts of the transition on jobs, but what we found is that there will be significant jobs created both in the transition for construction, but also ongoing in maintenance, as well as the support of manufacturing and industrial jobs into the future. We found that scenario C was the fastest to reach net zero emissions and actually achieves that 10 years ahead of the target, which indicates to us that that diverse mix of energy sources is really worth looking at a bit more. We found that the cost for all of these scenarios was pretty similar across scenario A, B, and C, but was dramatically higher for the centralised brown hydrogen with carbon capture and storage proposal. So that suggests to us that that scenario is not really worth chasing down, but that we will be looking at what the best elements of each of those scenarios, which may include some brown hydrogen with CCS, and look at the costs and benefits of that going forward. Costs at the moment have been presented as a relative cost index because of the limited accuracy of those, and we will be working to improve those cost estimates for the next phase of analysis. The analysis also looked at the impact on the existing gas transmission and infrastructure network, so what the phasing of the transition away from that might be, considering the mix of biogas, hydrogen and electricity. Again, we found that there is room for a lot more optimization of that. So that's something that, again, we will be looking at in the next phase. As well as the relative extent of electrical upgrades. Again, this first analysis, again, no surprises, shows that that would be the most extensive requirement in scenario A, the full electrification. But we will, in the next phase of detailed work, be looking at how that could be optimized effectively. The stakeholder engagement to date has been pretty targeted, and so we are looking forward to hearing from more people on what the pros, cons, risks and opportunities are in the transition. We've done some targeted stakeholder engagement so far, as I mentioned, across a number of different groups, and we will be looking to significantly expand that in this consultation phase. And moving forward, also engage with stakeholders as we develop recommendations. So the last couple of slides are a summary of our key findings from the report. I'm not going to read all of these off because that's a bit boring, and you can you can look at that. But what we but I'll just go through some of the key points. So look, there will be significant change required in our approach to gas if we are going to meet those net zero emissions targets. Obviously, business as usual is a possible option for Victoria, but we already know that results in very significant carbon emissions, and we will need to look at how those are reduced if we are going to meet our net zero emissions target. The gas transition, as we've seen from the interjurisdictional analysis, is likely to take decades, and so we really do need to start now. The government has announced their interim targets and some sector pathways, but we do need to have more clarity around how we are going to get there. Meeting emissions reduction in the next decade will be critical to achieving our 2050 targets. All of the analysis that we've done, plus those of others, indicates that we do need to act now with the solutions that are available to us now, while we figure out what the next bits of that transition are, and get those ready to come in place so that we can have an ongoing effort in order to meet those targets by 2050. We have also found that we do need to have a range of strategies in place to manage the risk, to minimise the costs and to create those opportunities. There's a number of considerations that we've put forward in our interim report that we look forward to hearing your feedback on. And that's also the approach that seems to be working so far in countries including the UK and the Netherlands. So as we mentioned, the technological readiness of things like green hydrogen and some of these other solutions is varied. So we will need to continue our investment in research and development, in pilot projects as we figure out what's going to work. We're not there yet. We don't know what the optimal solution looks like. But regardless of which pathway ultimately works, there will need to be significant change for households and businesses given our significant gas use and emissions from those sectors, which means we do need to start thinking already about behaviour change. Behaviour change, as we know from campaigns around recycling, around quitting smoking, around skin cancer, takes time. And it takes a lot of repetition, and so we do need to be conscious of that. As we've seen, we also need to make sure that we've got appropriate measures in place for communities where English is a second language, and consider specifically the kind of support that might be needed in different communities with different characteristics. So we've also highlighted, as others have, including AEMO, that there is a potential gas shortfall coming, and that the gas transition more broadly needs to consider both demand and supply. This will minimise the risk of overinvestment in new or repurposed infrastructure, for which ultimately the cost flows through to consumers, and that affordability is very important to both consumers and to the government. Energy efficiency is a no regrets measure. It's proven, it's cost effective, and it creates better outcomes for consumers. We will be doing some more work on this going forward. We acknowledge that the government has already energy efficiency programs in place, but we are keen to look at what more might be possible there. So as I've said, reducing Victoria's overall gas demand, particularly in the household and commercial sectors, can reserve supplies for critical industrial purposes such as chemicals manufacturing, where it is either not possible or extremely difficult to replace that natural gas use. So it does enable us to make smart decisions going forward about where the best use of our gas resources is, in order to manage costs, manage supply, and manage those emissions. We acknowledge that there may also be a role for gas-fired electricity generation to support our increasing use of renewable energy during the transition to net zero, and obviously this is something that others, including Grattan, have looked at. It's something that we are continuing to examine in our scenario analysis going forward. We do think that there is a role, at least in the for government to support further development and demonstration of those emerging technologies, and also to proactively monitor the results of those pilots, and to play a part in the design of those so that the strategic needs of Victoria are being considered. Our early findings suggest that there is scope for more consideration of the pathway to net zero in our infrastructure decision making. For example, we have talked in our draft strategy about the relative risks and benefits of the current continued expansion of the gas network for new households. Now, that's something that does need to be weighed up against a zero net emissions future and the cost to consumers of having that option available. And so to wrap up the key findings, we would like to note that our scenarios were designed around meeting the net zero 2050 target, which was the only one that had been published during that work. But towards the end of our analysis period, the government did put out their interim targets. So what we found based on the scenarios that we had was that the 2030 target will be very challenging to meet. But again, we'll be doing some more work looking at how the scenarios, how the preferred or a hybrid scenario for Victoria could really be designed to help meet those interim targets, and what the trade-offs would be in order for that to happen. So as Michelle mentioned, we are seeking submissions that will be via the Engage Victoria website. The interim, there are some specific consultation questions there. We welcome your response to any or all of those, or indeed anything else that you might wish to tell us, which doesn't fit neatly into those consultation questions. We are very excited to be at this stage where we can seek feedback. You can read the interim report on either our website or the Engage Vic website, and there are links to the supporting technical reports. Again, we welcome your feedback on any aspects of those, and that will inform the next stage of our analysis, as well as the final advice and recommendations that we will be making to government by the end of the year. As Michelle mentioned, all of this work is also feeding into the government's gas roadmap. We acknowledge that many of you will be participating in those consultation phase for that work as well. But time is of the essence, so information that you're able to provide to both projects will make it more efficient for us to collect that information, and so we certainly encourage you to consider that. So now we move on to the question and answer period, and I'm going to hand over to Maddie to facilitate that session.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and welcome back, Michelle and Jonathan. I'll direct the first question, if I may, to Jonathan. It's just in regards to the scenarios that we have in the interim report. Can you take us through a bit more detail of those and discuss how IV might be refining those to find a preferred pathway to 2050?
Yeah, sure, Maddie. I'll certainly be very happy to do that. I think it's important because Alyssa's given you a good sense of how we've used that, I think, for our interim report. So we've developed these 4 scenarios for this first phase of work to really explore some of the key variables that we know that are in place especially around different technology mixes, and also whether they are truly zero emission or net zero with offsets and reliance on, technology like carbon capture and storage, the different forms of hydrogen, biogas, and those mixes of electrification with gas firming. So the scenarios that we put forward they're plausible, but they're relatively extreme. And we're doing that on purpose to, if you like, sort of draw the box around the possibilities of what's looking like it's worth further developing in more detail as we do our more refined scenario modelling. Because what we're going to be doing is taking both the results of those scenarios that Alyssa's described to you, but also all the feedback that we get from you who are listening today, and using that to help refine what looks like a more plausible and viable and optimized scenario for the future of gas in Victoria. So when you're looking at these results that are in our interim report and some of the technical reports, don't necessarily focus on the absolute numbers, because these are really designed as scenarios to compare against each other to get a sense of, well, what's looking better than others. We will do things like optimize the mix, like looking at the connections between Victoria's energy system and, of course, the interconnected energy network in other states in ways that are more sophisticated in this initial scenario modelling. But what you do get is that comparisons between the different mixes. And as Alyssa said, it starts to tell us a story about a mix of energy sources, and probably not only the mix of the sources, but also the diversity of their locations. Being something that is quite different to the centralised energy system that we've had up to date in Victoria. And that's actually pretty consistent with what's happening with the electricity system overall anyway. So any feedback any of you today who are listening have got on what you think around some of those elements of those scenarios, something we'd really appreciate. Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'll just have a follow-up question about the scenarios from Harriet Floyd, who has asked, can you explain why scenario D predicts much higher energy consumption in 2050 compared to the other scenarios?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'll make a start on that. So a good question, Harriet. So scenario D is a good example of what I was talking about before, it being a plausible but relatively extreme example, because what that scenario is doing, it's saying, let's see if brown hydrogen created from brown coal in Victoria could effectively meet all of those energy supply requirements that the natural gas system is currently providing. And it ends up being something that with our modelling finds that there's a lot of energy entailed in the process of creating that brown hydrogen from the coal, and also in the CCS process, and then getting that energy with the brown hydrogen to consumers. And so that's why you get both higher energy use and also quite high costs in terms of that process of doing so. So one of our conclusions is that when you look at the scale of brown hydrogen production in scenario D, that's not looking like something that is very competitive in relation to the other scenarios. That isn't to say there might not be some future for brown hydrogen in Victoria. And of course, there's projects that are examining brown hydrogen production for export to Japan at the moment. But at that scale that we modelled in scenario D, that seems to be one that doesn't look particularly attractive. I'm not sure if Alyssa, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've covered the key points there nicely, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll just turn to a question now about, and I might turn to Alyssa for this one if I may, the role of electrification in the path to net zero according to our scenarios is looking pretty strong, but will the final report look at the role of energy distribution infrastructure, and in particular distributive networks, and the role of new gases in that as well, I guess, the implications for gas in those scenarios?
Yeah, so look, obviously this is one of the key questions and uncertainties in the potential to electrify our energy supply more. You know, what is the balance between utility scale electricity generation and distribution versus small local scale? So what is the difference between having lots and lots of big solar farms or big offshore wind farms, or having less of those and having more solar panels on roofs, for example? What is the difference between having lots of big utility scale batteries versus lots of household or small business batteries? So our scenario design had some assumptions around that that we considered, where we considered either a smaller or a larger uptake of those smaller scale batteries and distributed energy generation for some of those scenarios. We will be looking at trying to optimize that to some extent as part of the way forward, but it is very much an uncertainty that will depend on the future cost of batteries and also the the potential or the amount for which we look at other storage options like pumped hydro. So again, there will be another phase of that coming through, and we will have some findings to present, but we will focus on how those things present implications for the gas infrastructure, with some treatment of electricity, because that's what we've been asked to do. We're not using this project to try and completely redesign the state's electricity system per se, but we will be able to present some more findings on that as we move forward.
Thanks, Elisa. The next question I'll direct back to Jonathan, if I may, and it's from Sanja Van Hewitt, and it's in regard to the banning of gas installations in new build growth corridors as a way to sort of address the gas shortfall. Did you have any comment about that particular issue in the report?
Yeah, certainly. So this is something we've actually looked at and was a draft recommendation in the draft of our 30-year infrastructure strategy that was released in December, and we've been consulting on earlier this year. And as Michelle mentioned, we will have that final strategy released next month. What we have identified in that is that continuing to mandate the connection of gas infrastructure in new housing estates does risk locking in the use of natural gas, but also the cost of that asset. And what we flagged in the draft strategy then was that removing that mandate that you have to have connection of natural gas in new housing estates might be one step towards reducing the risk of that being a stranded asset, and providing people with choice about whether that's a cost that they want to incur. We haven't really looked at it so much as a demand management issue, although it would over time certainly reflect that. But there's probably a broader question that's going on around both the lifetime of assets that we're putting in and the cost and utilization of those assets, which is something we're going to be looking at in more detail in the next phase of our study, but also about consumer preferences and people's understanding and desire for substituting potentially natural gas appliances and heating for other forms of cooking and heating that we can do through electrification. And that's something we're also undertaking some studies on to better understand people's preferences, because that clearly is important as we move over the next couple of decades to make this transition, which as Alyssa's pointed out, in some other jurisdictions like the UK and the Netherlands, they're starting to head down that path. But you've got to give people practical alternatives, and you've also got to make sure you're not locking in infrastructure that we've got to pay for and use for too long or too early. Any feedback that anyone's got on that is something we'd really appreciate, both in terms of asset life, in terms of the practicality of that, how much it practically impacts development choices, and any information people have got about consumer preferences on that kind of choice would be something we'd really find very valuable.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. I've got a question here from Dale Storer, and there's a few questions similar to this, which is really a discussion about the ability for hydrogen gas to actually be used in the existing pipelines, and examples of that from across the country and from across the world, and what that might mean for Victoria's network. Alyssa, if you wouldn't mind tackling that one.
Thanks, Manny. Yeah, so this gets right to the heart of our particular project. So there's some pretty well-established research out there that shows that some of the materials that our gas infrastructure is made from cannot be used for 100% pure hydrogen for a number of reasons, particularly that well, number one, it becomes unsafe in some circumstances because the pipes can become brittle and can fail. There's also issues around the capacity of some of those pipes. So hydrogen has a different energy content to natural gas, and you need different sized pipes to deliver the right amount of energy. We know from the existing research that there is likely to be a limit as to the safe blending of hydrogen within natural gas. Now, from what we've seen so far, people think it's probably between 10 and 20%, but that hasn't been completely nailed down yet. There are some projects around Australia and the world that are specifically looking at that question. But we also know that some of our infrastructure is made from materials that would be able to be reused for hydrogen. So we've got some general discussion on that in the detailed scenario analysis report that's on our website that we would welcome any feedback on, but also in the interim report. And we will be doing another piece of work that is specifically looking at the asset life and condition and adaptability of our existing gas infrastructure in Victoria. So that includes infrastructure in homes and businesses, the distribution network, the transmission network, production facilities. So we will have some more detailed and specific information to be able to provide to government on that. And which leads us obviously to the question around appliances. So there again, we acknowledge that there are some known issues with the appliances currently prevalent in our homes where they might be able to be or are likely to be able to be used for hydrogen blends. But potentially not in all cases and probably not for pure hydrogen use. Again, we acknowledge that there is some very significant work underway in Australia and around the world looking at what a hydrogen ready appliance standard might be and what benefits or costs that may have to consumers. So we're looking forward to be able to present some more concrete information to government. So if you have any, we would very much welcome that, just in case we've missed something in our research so far. Thanks, Maddie.
No worries. And I have another question now from Andrew Mason, who's asked what consideration has been given to realistic options for high-use industries to transition away from gas, and he's identified dairy processing in particular and milk drying. Who wants to tackle that one? Shall I give that to Jonathan, please?
Sure, I'll certainly make a start, and Alyssa may want to add to that. So at a high level, I guess our approach to this is looking at where are the options for us to be able to move natural gas use away from users that don't have to use it. And so that then leaves those who must use it in some industrial applications with the opportunity to do so while still meeting the sort of emissions targets that we're seeking to do. So it's not necessarily about removing the availability of natural gas for industrial uses where that's unavoidable, because if we can make change in lots of other sectors, that means that we might still be able to do so and meet those emission targets that we want. So that's the first sort of overarching piece. In some of the technical studies that we've got going at the moment, we're certainly looking at some of those energy efficiency and substitution opportunities, and it's something we would really very much like to hear from stakeholders and submissions at this phase about firstly, where there are areas where substitution for other gases that meet the heating requirements, for example, or the chemical input requirements is possible, versus where that's not the case. And so where there are truly irreplaceable uses of natural gas, we've got a sense of that, but we'd really like to hear that from you as users and stakeholders in industrial context. Alyssa, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. So there's a bit of work, quite a bit of work that's out there already, as we've alluded to, on where it may be possible to either electrify existing industries or to move to other gases. So in answer to this specific question, I don't know what information, if any, there is out there that relates specifically to dairy. I know that food manufacturing more broadly has been looked at, so we would welcome any additional information that might be available on that. We will, as part of our next phase of work, be delving into that into a little more detail, with the intent of being able to identify the best bang for buck in terms of either in terms of energy efficiency or electrification improvements that may really assist in this way. The other thing that we're looking at as part of our scenario and our next phase of scenario analysis is where whether there's a different best solution for gas use in different parts of the state. So, for example, what the real potential for biogas and biomethane, which is refined biogas, might be in different areas, particularly regional areas where they are close to those feedstocks of agricultural and organic waste, but where there is also a market for that energy use in things like dairy processing. So there's a couple of different tacks that we're taking to look at that. We will be aiming to be as specific as possible, but at the moment we do acknowledge that most of the information that we've come across, at least, has bundled those uses up a bit higher than into things like the degree of industrial heat that is required, rather than necessarily looking at the dairy industry specifically.
Thanks very much. And I'm just mindful that we're heading towards the end of our time. So thank you very much for everyone that submitted a question. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. I might just hand back to Michelle for some final observations and comments.
Thank you very much, Maddie, and thank you very much, Elisa and Jonathan, for responding so well to the various questions that were put to us. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very mindful that the work that we're undertaking on the transition of the gas is a very complex one. It's one in which there are some very strong views, not necessarily converging towards the same solution, which really plays to the strength of what Infrastructure Victoria can bring to this debate. Our independence means that we can really come to you and hear about all of those different views and make an absolute independent undertaking of what ultimately a favored pathway or a hybrid pathway will be. As Elisa mentioned, we've got a lot more work to do ahead of us. The consumer research will be fundamental to ultimately the positions we will be recommending to the Victorian government, because we are at heart talking about changing behaviours and accompanying the customers in this journey. We're also very mindful that there is a lot of work that we want to undertake in regards to the state of the assets and the ability to really make the most of the assets that we currently have, leveraging on those technologies, but also being very mindful that there are a lot of question marks, a lot of knowns and unknowns in regards to which of this technology is likely to take off, and what are the right environments which the Victorian government can create for those technologies to receive all of the capital necessary together with the roles that maybe directly the Victorian government can play. So for that, we are absolutely welcoming your views. You are the experts in the field. You've done some work that we may not be aware of. So on all of the themes that we've touched on today, we really and strongly invite you to be part of that conversation and reach out to us via the Engage Vic platform or directly to really share with us your reactions to what we're presenting to you, your different views, making sure that we hear from you in our ability to make our final determination in the second half of this year to deliver our report to the government. Again, being very mindful that this will complement and inform independently the work that the department is doing on the gas road transmission. So ladies and gentlemen, we take continuous improvement very seriously at Infrastructure Victoria. So you will receive very shortly a survey, which I will invite you to fill in regards to the webinar that we've done today. This is very valuable for us to make sure that we take your feedback into consideration for the next webinars. And I do invite you to visit our website, where you will not only find, of course, our interim report, but all of the technical reports, either from consulting firms or which we've developed ourselves. And not just, of course, on this advice. Infrastructure Victoria is present on all sectors of infrastructure. And over the years, we've built a library freely available of fresh evidence, technical reports, which is an absolute gold mine for people like you to find fresh evidence and this technical evidence to inform whatever you're working on. So ladies and gentlemen, let me close this meeting by thanking you very much for being with us today. And in the very unusual circumstances in which we are in Australia, let me finish by wishing you to stay safe and well in the current circumstances. Thank you very much.